All right, now that we've covered the scopes, we're now ready to start doing color correction. In this tutorial, we'll be covering the first step in the base correction stage, and that is of setting the correct exposure. Our objective is to get nice exposed images using the correction tools found in Adobe Premiere. But you might sometimes wonder, what constitutes a correctly exposed image? What are the ideal luma values for things like skin tones? And where should I be setting my highlights? It may seem like a moving target, but they don't have to be. Fortunately, we have an answer to this in the form of the zone system pioneered by famous black and white photographer Ansel Adams. Throughout his career, he studied the ideal exposure levels in black and white print and photography. He developed this study into the zone system. Ranging from 0 to 10, the zone system describes ideal exposure values for things like tree foliage, skin tones, and snow. Using the zone system as a reference, we can easily adapt it to our waveform scope for our purposes. We'll find pure black on the zone system represented as 0 on the scope, middle gray at 50, and pure white at 100. If we're working within the safe limits for broadcast, then we take this range into consideration. The Ansel Adams zone system can be a valuable resource when first starting out in color grading. And then once we become more familiar with judging correct exposure, then you won't need to refer to the zone system as much. Gauging the correct exposure just takes some practice. While the Ansel Adams zone system breaks exposure out into 10 different zones, we'll often refer to exposure in a more general sense to describe the 3 main tonal ranges. We'll use the term shadows to describe the darkest parts of the image, the term highlights to refer to the brightest parts of the image, and the term midtones to refer to everything else in between the shadows and highlights. Okay, now that we've covered the basic terminology, let's do some color correction. In the first example, we have a shot that's underexposed. We can see that most of the trace is gathered here towards the bottom of the scope. We can also see the shadows are slightly elevated. As we work through correcting for exposure, we typically work in the order of correcting the shadows, highlights, and then midtones, so we'll follow that order as we go. There are a number of ways to adjust exposure in the Lumetri color tools, and we'll cover all of them in this tutorial. But let's start by making adjustments in the basic correction panel. Now, if you look at the controls in the basic corrections panel, you'll see controls for highlights and shadows, but also whites and blacks. Lumetri uses the terminology in this panel slightly differently than other color grading applications. So here's how these controls work. The blacks control adjusts the darkest parts of your image, and the whites control adjusts the brightest parts. The shadows control affects the tonal range between the shadows and the midtones that you'll often hear me refer to as the quarter tones or undertones. And then the highlights control affects the tonal range between the highlights and the midtones, which you'll hear me refer to as the 3/4 tones or overtones. So now you might ask, Denver, didn't you just say that the shadows were the darkest parts of the image and the highlights were the brightest parts? Yes, I did, because that's the typical way that colorists refer to these zones. But in the Lumetri Basic Corrections panel, things work just a little bit different. This can be a little confusing at first, but we'll get lots of practice using these controls so that you can get comfortable. Okay, so now going back to our image, let's use the blacks control to drop down the shadows so the darkest parts of the image sits just above 0. I don't want to go too far so that the trace ends up below 0 because I'd begin to lose some detail in the shadows. This is known as crushing the blacks, and unless you're going for a stylized look, this is something that you want to avoid. Now we need to determine where the highlights should be. Looking at this image, it's clear that the window is the brightest part, but where should that part of the image sit on the waveform? Let's go back to the Ansel Adams zone system. 10 is pure white, 9 is slight tonality with no detail, and 8 has detail. Just by looking at it, I can see that the window contains information covering all 3 of these zones. So I'm going to use the whites control to bring up the highlights until the brightest parts of the window are just about touching the 10th zone or the 100 mark on the waveform. Okay, that makes a dramatic difference to our image. Now let's take a look at the skin tones so we can see where we're at with them. Since it's sometimes difficult to spot just the skin tones in the waveform, I'll share with you a really cool trick that will enable us just to see the skin tones in the waveform. Using Premiere's mask tools, we can isolate just the skin tones and see them in the waveform scope. Let's double-click the first shot and go into the effect controls. Now we'll click the pen tool. I'll draw a rough outline to just isolate the skin tones, and then switch back to the Lumetri scopes. You can see that the skin tones stretch from Zone 2 all the way to Zone 7, with the majority of information sitting between Zone 3 and Zone 5. Let's use a combination of the highlights and shadows control to bring the exposure up so that the majority of the information sits between Zones 4 and 7. I'll drag the highlight slider up and the shadow slider down just a touch. Now let's turn off our mask by going into the effects control and clicking the FX checkbox for opacity. The highlights control pushed up the brightest highlights a bit too far, so we'll back them off with the whites control to restore them to their previous level. Now something you may notice is a change to the saturation or the amount of color. When you increase the exposure of an image, it can have the perceived effect of lowering saturation. Conversely, when you decrease the exposure, the viewer's perception of saturation increases. So as a final touch to this image, I'll just add some saturation. Let's take a look at the before and after by checking the basic corrections checkbox off. And then back on again. Looking much better. Okay, let's move to another example. This time, the shadows are looking pretty good, but the rest of the image is really underexposed. Just making an adjustment to the brightest parts of the image will get us most of the way there. For this shot, I'd like to introduce you to the color wheels panel. As you can see, this panel adheres to the commonly used terms of shadows, midtones, and highlights for the three controls. So like before, we'll first address the shadows. They seem to be sitting in a good spot just above 0, so we'll leave them where they are. Now with the highlights control, I'd like to bring the highlights all the way up until the sky reaches the top of the 8th zone. So I'll drag the exposure control for the highlights up. Unfortunately, this didn't give us quite as much as we needed. So let's go back to the basic corrections panel for some help. Let's first reset this control by double-clicking on it. Then go to the basic corrections panel, and then drag the whites control all the way up. Okay, now we can go back to the color wheels panel and adjust the highlights even further until the brightest highlights sit right up around the top of the 8th zone. This is already looking better, but let's increase the midtones as well to bring the skin tones up. It's important to note that the three tonal ranges all affect each other. In other words, if you make a big increase to the midtones, the shadows and highlights will be affected as well. This image details to what extent each zone affects the other zones. As you can see, a change to the highlights even has a small effect on the shadows, just as a change to the shadows affects the highlights to a certain extent. So in this case, our significant change to the midtones had an effect on the highlights as well. So let's bring the highlights down a touch to compensate for this. In this image, even after our midtones adjustment, the skin tones will fall a little bit lower than the recommendations on the zone system. That's okay, because you have to remember that the context of every shot is as important as being aware of the zone system. For instance, this image was shot later in the day after sunset, so it will naturally be a little darker than the recommendations on the Adams chart. For this next shot, we'll explore the contrast control. I don't use this control on every shot, but in some cases, it can give you a really good result, or at least a really good starting point for your color correction. I'm going to drag the contrast control all the way to the right. That's a huge improvement, and then we can make some final touches by dragging the black slider to the left and the shadows control to the right to restore the detail in the quarter tones. Very nice. The next image has issues with overexposure. This was captured on the red camera and is currently being encoded as red log gamma, so it's really flat and washed out. It also has a problem with lens flare, which is caused by light shining directly into the camera lens. This also lowers the contrast in the image. You can see that the trace is collected toward the top of the scope, and there's some clipping going on in the highlights. In case you don't know what clipping is when the signal goes above the range that the camera can record, resulting in clipped or lost details. It's also sometimes referred to as being blown out, and sometimes we can pull back the information and other times we can't. For this image, since so much information is bunched up at the top of the waveform, I'm going to have a start with the exposure control and drag the trace down until it sits in the middle. This will give us a good starting point that is easier to work with. Now I can see that there really isn't anything to recover in the brightest parts of the image due to the flat, clipped tops of the trace. That's okay though, we can still make this image work. This time, I'd like to make the adjustments using the Curves panel, which will give us a lot more control over our image and will be great for an image like this that faces some difficult problems. I'll open the Curves panel and explain to you how this works. The bottom left point on the curves adjusts the darkest parts of the image, much like the lift control, while the top right point controls the brightest parts of the image, or like the highlights control. The advantage with curves is that you can make as many points along the curve as you like, which gives us more precise control. Let's try them out. First, let's drag the bottom point to the right until the darkest parts of the trace are right above 0. Then we'll drag the top point so that the brightest highlights are just under 100. Then I'll make a point here and drag up. This increases the exposure of our 3/4 tones without making any major changes to the brightest highlights. While that improves the exposure of the image, the quarter tones, or parts of the image that fall in this range on the waveform scope, are still looking a bit washed out. Let's make another point here and drag it down, creating what is called an S-curve. If you look at the waveform as this point is adjusted, you'll see that not much changes above the 7th zone, since the point we added is protecting the brightest parts of the image from adjustments. This is another advantage of using curves. As a final adjustment, let's increase the saturation back in the basic corrections panel. Looking good. The Curves panel gave us the increased control that we needed to greatly improve a difficult image. Now let's try out the curves on an image that's a little more straightforward. Like before, we'll drop the shadows using the bottom point, and then bring the highlights up until the light in the ceiling touches the 10th zone. Now, just like we do with the gamma control, we'll make a point in the middle where the mid-range is and drag it up. While we could have made this same correction using the exposure controls in the color wheels or basic corrections panel, I just wanted to point out that curves can also be used even when the image doesn't require a complex correction. Lastly, I just want to point out that making adjustments with the basic corrections panel, curves, or color wheels won't help you with some images. In this case, we have overexposed skin tones. If you drag the highlights control down, it doesn't recover much of the detail and just makes the image look muddy. If we continue to pull back on the highlights to bring the skin tones to zone 5 or 6, it just reduces the overall brightness of the image. And trying it with the gamma control doesn't allow us to go after the most blown out areas. Now, I won't show you in this tutorial, but in a later tutorial, I'll share with you a technique for isolating the skin tones and performing a secondary correction to recover them. I just wanted to show you an overexposed image that we can't simply fix with Lumitri's exposure tools. So in conclusion, I suggest using the Ansel-Adams zone system initially as a guide to help you with balancing the exposure, midtones, and highlights. I hope this tutorial has been helpful in helping you understand how to set the proper exposure levels.